Hello everyone, this is Dell, and I'm going to be talking about the Alligator Poem by Mary Oliver. Who was Mary Oliver? Mary Oliver was an American poet born in Maple Hill Heights, a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio in 1935. In an effort to escape a difficult home life, she would venture into the woods to play and write poetry. Despite the fact that she attended a lot of universities, she never received a college degree, but she did get an honorary doctorate degree from the Art Institute of Boston, Dartmouth College, and Tufts University, and she died in 2019 at the age of 83. Mary Oliver's awards. So these are some of the awards that she won for her books. Her fifth book, American Primitive, won the Pulitzer Prize, and in 1992, her book New Selected Poems won the National Book Award. She was the Catherine Osgood Foster Chair for Distinguished Teaching at Bennington College until 2001. She was a fellow at the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for Arts, and she won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, the Poetry Society of America's Shelley Memorial Prize, and Alice Faye de Casganola Award. Mary Oliver's influences. As a child, her poetic influence was Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she moved to Millay's house as a young adult to help organize Edna's papers. She and her partner, Molly Malone Cook, would move to Massachusetts, where Cape Cod would become an influential backdrop in her poetry. Oliver's poetry has a distinctive romantic nature tradition, focusing on observations of nature. Critics have compared her poetry to Mariana Moore, Elizabeth Bishop, Edna St. Vincent Millay, James Wright, and Walt Whitman.
I'm going to read aloud Mary Oliver's The Alligator Poem. I knelt down at the edge of the water, and if the white birds standing in the rocks of the trees whistled any warning, I didn't understand. I drank up to the very moment it came crashing towards me, its tail flailing, like a bundle of swords, slashing the grass and the insides of its cradle-shaped mouth gaping, and rimmed with teeth. And that is how I almost died of foolishness in beautiful Florida. But I didn't. I leapt aside and fell, and it streamed past me, crushing everything in its path as it swept down the water and threw itself in. And, in the end, this isn't a poem about foolishness, but about how I rose from the ground and saw the world as if it was for the second time, the way it really is. The water, that circle of shattered glass, healed itself with a slow whisper and layback. With the black lit light of the polished steel, and the birds and the endless waterfalls of the trees shook open the snowy pleats of their wings, it drifted away. While, for a keepsake, and to steady myself, I reached out. I picked the wild flowers from the grass around me, blue stars and blood-red trumpets, on a long green stem. For hours in my trembling hands they glittered. Fire. The inspiration behind Mary Oliver's poem, The Alligator Poem, is actually really interesting. She once said in a National Public Radio interview, quote, "Like a lot of my poems, it began in an actual experience and became a kind of epiphany after the fact. I was in a place called Luxacachi, and it was several years ago. I was walking along and it was hot and I was thirsty, and I knelt down, as the poem begins to say, and heard an awful lot of noise very quickly, and never got my drink of water, but I got the poem," end quote. Mary Oliver also stated in that very same National Public Radio interview, "I meant by that what almost happened, what might have happened, but very luckily didn't happen, was, of course, the closure of my own life, and I was really terribly frightened, but also dazzled by the realization that I was still alive, that I had a kind of second world that I could arise from the grass and love. And that's the way I think the world really is. It's the world we come to terms with when something like this happens, or just perhaps growing up and realizing that death is at the end of the road. Through accident, happenstance, old age, leaping reptile, or however it might come, end quote.
Let's talk about Mary Oliver's work in nature. Oliver's work is described as, quote, an earthly delight. And nature is a common theme throughout her work, not just Alligator Poem. Quote, but a river of loss runs underground in her poems, whose deeper currents are sometimes an unspoken source, propelling the poet out into the natural world. The world itself restores her to herself. Its vitality and beauty restore her to herself, end quote. As we see in this poem, it is not just an eloquent piece about an alligator. It is a piece which explores the feeling of, quote, seeing the world as if for the second time, as it really is, end quote. The subject of Oliver's poetry is not just nature itself, but also looks at how the, quote, natural world does more than restore or console. It also teaches the greater lesson of loving and letting go, end quote. Oliver's poems are as much about transformation as about observation. In Alligator Poem, the secret life of the world seems to open itself in the moment to human apprehension, transforming the world and self. There is such a naturalness to Oliver's poems that we may fail to notice their craft. Oliver's language stays close to the spoken American idiom, but infuses it with music and creates, through verbal design, images of startling vividness. In a poetry so attentive to detail, where line breaks focus our attention on particulars, the line is the device upon which the poem spins itself into being, she said. There is also an extraordinary power. Oliver builds her stanzas so they interlock one into another, and the reader is pulled through a series of perceptions into the poet's insight. In certain poems, the movement of her lines across the page rhythmically enacts the reaching forward and the pulling back of the poet's walk into the landscape. Throughout her poetry, and in Alligator Poem specifically, Oliver uses a plethora of colorful, figurative language. We see similes such as like a bundle of swords, and the flowers glittered like fire. We see metaphors such as in the endless waterfall of trees. The water, that circle of shattered glass. And another, the water lay back with the backlit light of polished steel. Personification is used to describe the water as it healed itself with a slow whisper. This is just a small overview of Alligator Poem and Oliver's work in general. I hope you've enjoyed it.